Hi all, we're continuing our discussion of chapter 14, and when I left off in the previous lecture, we were talking about recycling. I've also posted an additional video that shows you what it looks like inside of what they call a materials recovery facility. So this is where all of your recyclable goods go. So that is a separate video that I posted. It's from a company called Waste Management, and it gives you a really good idea of how recyclables are sorted and separated and then essentially sold to buyers who then will use those as a product in their own, will use those as a raw material in their own products. So rather than talking about recycling, I'm just going to share some information with you about recycling. Recycling really varies from country to country. And here in the United States, we're not great at it, but we're not horrible at it either. So if you compare us to other developed countries, especially countries in Europe, you will notice that we throw away a lot more stuff in landfills. As I mentioned before, we don't really burn very many things. We don't incinerate much, and then the rest is recycled. You can see that there are other countries, especially places like Germany and Sweden, where almost everything is exclusively either incinerated or recycled, simply because they don't have the space to be able to have these landfills like we do. So they are very space restricted. So the United States is doing okay with recycling, but we have a long way to go. I'm sorry, I just realized I wasn't in presentation mode. Here we go. So what do we recycle? Well, there's certain things we're really great at recycling and certain things we're not good at recycling. Auto batteries have almost 100% recycling rate, but that's mostly because when you go to purchase a new auto battery, you can turn your old auto battery in and there's a recycling that actually auto shops and companies will do. So that's one where the rate is as high as it is simply because we have a very good system in place to allow us to recycle those things. Other things, steel cans, aluminum cans tend to have higher recycling rates as well, especially because those are still worth some value when you turn them in. So you could collect aluminum and steel cans and turn them in and get paid for it. It's not a lot of money. It's a very small amount of money, but there's a financial incentive for those particular materials. Other things, paper and paperboard, tires, different types of plastic. We're not really great at recycling glass. That's probably one of the lowest of all our recycling rates, is about 25% of glass is recycled. A lot more glass could be recycled, but sometimes, again, we just don't necessarily think about it. So lots of benefits to recycling. Again, most of us have what's called a single stream recycling system, which means rather than having to separate your paper, your plastic, your glass, and your aluminum, you throw it all in one bin and the waste companies will come and pick it up. Saves a lot of money, saves space in landfills, saves raw materials. It's a lot cheaper to use recycled aluminum than it is to create brand new aluminum. So aluminum can manufacturers want your recycled aluminum. It costs them less to turn an old can into a new can than it does to create a whole new can. And there are several products like that. So here's just a picture of these big bales of paper. Again, they usually stack them up by weight, and then you will have someone who will come in and purchase these, and they will turn them into something else. They will turn them into new cardboard boxes, for example. I'm not going to go over composting too much other than to say that another way to divert things out of the landfill is taking organic waste and composting it. So organic waste would include things like vegetable scraps, fruit scraps, coffee grinds. You could put bread in there. Anything that isn't have anything that's not meat or has fats in it. You can put that in what's called a composting pile, or you can actually use a bin with worms. It's called vermicomposting. Basically, the natural process of decomposition will turn all of that into not to basically raw nutrients then that you could then put in your soil and use as fertilizers, for example. So composting is big, again, in some places. we don't do as much composting here in the United States, but it's certainly something that you could do if you were interested. We always talk about how great recycling is, and recycling is great, don't get me wrong. There's a lot of good things to be said about diverting waste from the waste stream through recycling, but there are other two things that we can do that are even better. It's reduce and reuse. So reusing is not having to throw it out at all. We don't need to go to a landfill. We don't need to go to a recycling center. We just need to find a new place for it, or a new home for it. So building materials are commonly can be reused. Different types of auto parts can be reused. So there's a lot of interest in trying to find creative reuses now. If you go sorry, quick interruption there. If you go to Pinterest now and look for creative reuse, you can find all kinds of ideas when it comes to reusing items. So that's a really big way to keep things out of the waste stream, is to simply find another use for them or another purpose for them, and that way we don't have to throw things out. So reducing waste, here's a whole bunch of little tips that your textbook has for you. Things like taking your own beverage containers to meetings, refillable water bottles. We've kind of talked about that already. Those are really big, but even, coffee mugs that you can actually have them fill up with coffee instead of getting a disposable cup. Bringing your own bags when you go grocery shopping. Again, making sure that you recycle as much as you can. So again, just a kind of a list of here's ways you can reduce your waste. So last thing I'm going to quickly mention is hazardous and toxic wastes. So all of our municipal solid waste things are things that in general aren't going to cause a lot of damage if you come into contact with them as far as humans and animals go, right? So cans and bottles and plastic and paper and all of those things, none of it is particularly hazardous if you come into contact with it. Our new category of waste, hazardous and toxic wastes, these are things that are so dangerous to both human health and the environment that we cannot come into contact with them at all. And these wastes are essentially produced by three major industries, the chemical and the petroleum industries, and the metal processing and mining. So making chemicals, making oil products, and making metals and mining. Those are the ones who are almost exclusively responsible for this waste. I did say that there is some hazardous waste that comes from hospitals and medical centers. So essentially anything that's contaminated with bodily fluids is considered hazardous. And so there's a special waste process for those items. But by and large, these are the big companies that are responsible for our hazardous waste. So hazardous waste has some legal definitions. You can read what those are. Basically, they can kill you, they can cause cancer, they can blow up, they're corrosive, those types of things. So what do we do with all of this stuff? Well, there's two different laws that were enacted. The Resource Conservation and Recovery Act was in the 70s, right around all the other times we were doing in the environmental legislation. And then CERCLA was passed in 1980 and then modified in 1984. Maybe you've heard of Superfund, for example. Both of these govern what you can and cannot do with hazardous waste and how it has to be disposed of. So this is sort of kind of like a tracking chart. Here is, let's say you have a place that generates hazardous waste. You would take that hazardous waste to some type of treatment facility to make it less hazardous, and then you would take it to like a landfill that was very, very secure for hazardous waste. This is the ideal way we would handle hazardous waste. However, there are still quite a few companies who illegally dump hazardous waste. And they either do that because they didn't have the money to pay for the disposal and cleanup of hazardous waste. They went bankrupt, they're no longer in business, these sites have been long abandoned, or they're inactive, and companies just can't pay to get them cleaned up. So that's where Superfund comes involved. It's basically a pool of government money that allows the government to step in and clean up all of these hazardous waste sites. It costs a lot of money to do that, hundreds of billions, maybe even trillions of dollars. And the problem is that toxic waste disposal is a permanent thing. These are things that we cannot come in contact with. It's not like our municipal waste that we can just bury under layers of dirt and then plant it with grass and call it a done day. We have to very carefully secure this material. So this is just some different Superfund sites all over the United States. You should notice that there's a fair concentration here in our area, the Chicago area. You'll notice that there's a ton of Superfund sites in Michigan that mostly has to do with steel industries, long since defunct steel industries and all of the waste that they created. But in any case, there's things that we can do. The biggest thing we can do is encourage companies not to produce toxic waste. That would kind of be the ideal way to do it. We can convert hazardous waste to less hazardous substances. We can mix things up. We can do some chemical processing, things like that. And then other things we just have to bury. We just have to bury them deep in the ground in a really secure landfill that we can permanently seal with concrete and clay and just completely seal it off and make sure that the materials inside of our hazardous waste containers aren't getting out. That's the idea. All right, so again, that kind of wraps things up for our discussion of solid waste and hazardous waste. I encourage you, if you've got the time, to watch the other video that I posted about how recyclables are sorted. It's kind of an interesting video, and it gives you a little bit more insight into the process and what we then do with those materials when we're done.